Hey everyone, my name is Soham from Weaviate. As Avi mentioned, I am the director of RevOps here, which can mean a lot of different things, a lot of different places, and probably a bit unique to see me here talking about open source and telemetry and tracking. But I think Avi mentioned it best, right? There's really an interesting surge in the open source community of understanding and trying to really capitalize on the commercialization of open source and what that looks like and how to do it effectively. And it's a motion that's happening right in front of our eyes. It's something that's changing every single day, and there's new software and new tools, especially with the advent of AI, that are making this more exciting and interesting and efficient. And so I consider myself super lucky to be kind of in the crux of all of that. And it makes my job super fun and challenging and intriguing and all those good things. So I'm here to talk a little bit about Weaviate, but mostly about kind of how we leverage Scarf and other tools. And then also here is just a resource for anybody that may need help or have any questions. And I'll stick around after as well. But I have a short couple of slides to go through, and we can go from there. So just a bit about Weaviate, and kind of why we care about open source. In a second, I'll get to that, right? But for those who don't know or haven't heard, Weaviate's an open source vector database. We transform all types of unstructured data into actionable insight and power things like semantic search, hybrid search. From its core, we're designed to power AI native applications, and tons of enterprise companies and digital native companies use Weaviate, trust Weaviate for kind of all of their vector database needs. From an open source standpoint, what makes my job really fun and Weaviate a really exciting place to work, in the context of what we all care about here, is we have over 13 million downloads and 10,000 plus GitHub stars. So we have a really entrenched, long-standing history in terms of the open source community, and that makes this a lot more fun and exciting when we talk about kind of commercializing open source data and really starting to understand and use it. So we have a really strong open source community, our Slack community, discourse forum, social media. Internally, we have a dev growth team that is just a super power for what they do and how they've grown this community. And like I said, it's all been kind of paying dividends over time, and this has been started from a long time ago. But that's Weaviate in a nutshell. Quick plug is we have an upcoming webinar for anybody that's thinking about this kind of stuff as well, later this week, and I'll go ahead and share some of those links. But that's Weaviate in a nutshell. So quick kind of precursor on open source and why we care about it. I'm assuming that I'm speaking to people who either are watching this later or here right now that are well versed in the benefits of open source. So I don't think I need to convince anybody here on why open source wins, but just kind of like a quick 30 seconds on Weaviate. We truly believe that open source is going to win in the long term, and that's why our CEO Bob and the rest of our team that was here in the early days 5 years ago decided that one of the first things they would do on the backs of building the actual vector database was to create a community around it and build open source software. Like I mentioned before, we've seen the dividends really grow exponentially over time, both in the sense of how we've been able to help the community of open source developers, but also how those developers have helped influence our product and improve our product. If you look through some of the stars, but also just the forks comments, and building that has happened on top of our open source profile and open source product, it's been super fascinating to see kind of how that's grown. So for anybody that's early days of this stuff, I probably am not in the position to give advice, but I can give you my viewpoint, which is this stuff really, really does pay off in the long term. And I think the flip side of that coin and why we're all here today is it's hard to see that payoff without tools that help commercialize that. And that's kind of what Scarf is really positioning themselves to do in terms of winning this market, from my viewpoint and as an end user, is to kind of leverage that data and show that data. So, the quick 5 seconds on why open source wins for us. Tons of community contributions, like I mentioned, reduces vendor lock-in, right? We compete both with managed products as well as open source products, but at the end of the day, we see and we believe that open source wins because people have the fluidity and flexibility to go build quickly and efficiently and test and iterate and figure out if it's the right tool for them. And it actually takes a lot of the load off of you internally as a team. You're not wasting tons of man hours and services to try to go convince somebody of something. Instead, you're talking to people who have ramped themselves, tested and validated their use cases internally, open source, and it makes your job a lot easier as a seller, as an operator, and overall as a company. And then global accessibility and adoption. We're seeing amazing results. I was blown away. I forgot to mention, I've only been at Weaviate for about 6 months, and I was blown away. One of the first meetings I had at Weaviate, one of the first things I did was getting our contract in place for Scarf. And when I got into the data and when I looked at the data, I was blown away with just kind of the volume and overall level of stuff that we had in there, which I'll get to in a second. So uh, that's open source. Kind of the meat here. So I'll try to keep this relatively concise, but if there's any questions at the end, I'm happy to answer. We use Scarf to drive revenue in kind of four real ways. And I think later Kevin from Common Room is going to talk a little bit more in detail and potentially, I don't want to overpromise, show some things on his end. And he's probably the right person to do that. But for full transparency, we also use Common Room, and it's a really, really impactful kind of 1-2 punch with Scarf and Common Room that I'm happy to touch on in more detail if we need to. But the first is actionable developer signals, right? I think this is pretty straightforward for all of you here who have been in Scarf, but if there's anybody here who hasn't or is considering it, you get real-time data on how developers are interacting with your open source product. We have the Scarf pixels installed on several of our open source packages, and we can see by package, by referral source, by date, time, company, tons of breakdowns of unique developers, total downloads, views. It's really kind of the effort you put in is what you're going to get out, and the setup that you create is what you're going to get out. And it's been really, really impactful. And like candidly, we've really only scratched the surface. I'm sure there's a lot we can do. I work with Dee from the Scarf team on almost a weekly or bi-weekly basis to go through and get that stuff and fine-tuned. But even just out of the box, it's been really, really helpful to see what kind of companies are using Weaviate, and then trying to kind of distill and figure out what they're doing. At the end of the day, our motion here is kind of what Avi mentioned, commercializing open source usage. So for us, we're really in this hyper-focused mode of trying to understand what open source usage means for Weaviate, how that translates to enterprise adoption, and at the end of the day, who those users are. And that's kind of like the big mystery and the fun puzzle that we're trying to unpack here is we have tons of open source data, and we're trying to figure out what to prioritize, when to prioritize, what signals matter, how to tackle it, with who to tackle it, what viewpoint developers care about. And it's just a ton of experimentation. There's no kind of one size fits all, but that's a bit on the actionable developer signals. Engagement at scale, right? So we basically, one of the biggest challenges in RevOps is kind of trying to identify the right accounts. The old school way of doing this, I don't know how many people on this call are in RevOps or work with RevOps folks, but the old school way of doing this is you create a named account list, you take a bunch of lookalike companies or just kind of a guess. Nobody really wants to say that, but you just put a bunch of accounts in a list and you go chase after them and assign them to reps and hope something works out and throw a bunch of people and effort at the problem. At the end of the day, what Scarf really does is it unlocks a new demand channel. And I think we obviously did a lot of the investment in our open source product and community, but at the end of the day, you do need a platform that kind of de-anonymizes that for you. And that's where Scarf kind of comes in for us. So Scarf provides the clarity that we need by highlighting the organizations that have those strong adoption signals. So if we see a cluster of downloads as an example coming from a specific company or an increase in API calls, or we've made a change in our end in terms of how our open source package functions, we can actually tie that one-to-one in real time and know that this account is becoming more high value. A BDR should go focus their time on this. A sales rep's key account has spiked in open source usage, and we can go kind of try to unpack and figure that out. In terms of aligned outreach strategies, this is pretty straightforward, but again, not sure how many people here work directly with sellers or are sellers, but we can tailor our outreach strategies based on specific patterns that we're starting to see. And this is where it really starts to get fun. You can unlock by motion, product line, referral source, type of company, industry, Global 2000 versus not, all the different slices and dices of your ICP that you can kind of imagine. You can basically align your outreach strategies based on those patterns that you're seeing. And that's something we're actively kind of working on today. But that alignment really ensures that the messaging is always super relevant and solution driven. At the end of the day, taking a step back, all you're really doing with Scarf data is you're taking product usage data from a new demand source, right? There's been a kind of very quick, but almost feels like old now, introduction of product usage data through things like your own first party data, signups, number of seats, so on and so forth, that you can kind of create instrumentation around. But open source has been historically and still continues to be pretty challenging to try to figure out those metrics because it's open source and it's inherently built that way. But What you can get is some kind of information around the companies that are using you and the trends that you can see on a high level. And something is better than nothing, right? And that's kind of been the eye-opening piece here, is that we would have really had nothing without this kind of visibility. So um, it's a little bit on the outreach strategies. And then the last is kind of revenue insights, right? Like we're able to really see from a company standpoint, especially, and this is where Common Room comes in for us, but other tools are out there, other methods can be created to kind of go get this visibility. But I think the real unlock happens when you're able to pair this with signals across the board that you care about. Common Room enables things like views, stars, comments, forks on your GitHub repo, pixels on your website. If someone visits your pricing page, like all these kinds of things that I'm sure Kevin can describe better than I can later. But you pair that with the open source baseline data, and you start to really get a holistic picture of what your accounts are doing. And at the end of the day, what we all care about, or at least I care about, is buying intent. And buying intent becomes a lot easier to de-anonymize, unpack, and understand when your baseline is there's open source usage. And tying this all together, we're still learning. So we're going and talking to customers who we see tons of open source usage through Scarf. Turns out they're just experimenting, and they built a pipeline through one particular team and they wanted to test something out. All good. Now we know, and we have that information that we would not have had otherwise. On the flip side, we're closing deals that have no open source usage, and that's in and of itself a learning opportunity for us. But for the purposes of this kind of conversation and open source in general, we're already seeing the multiple avenues that open source can take, and it's all just about learning for us and talking to the users and doing what's best for the user. And speaking to developers is really, really challenging in and of itself. And I think last Scarf Summit, some people touched on this. But at the end of the day, I think what's resonated most for us is really genuinely caring about their experience when building. And the more we can see about what they're doing open source, the more we can cater to helping them, whether that's guiding them to the right documentation, helping understand their AI initiatives. Once we get kind of more detail on their open source build, can we actually help optimize it and guide them to the right place? Maybe that's not the right way to be building, but this is all in the name of trying to get them where they need to be as quickly and efficiently as possible. So those are kind of like the four big pillars of Scarf and why it matters for us. And selfishly, I just want to put this out there again. If anybody is in RevOps, worked with RevOps, it's a super fun time to be part of a function like this, because I think 5 years ago, I wouldn't even be talking about any of this stuff, much less working on it internally at Weaviate or any company, because ops was ops and go-to-market was go-to-market. But everything's kind of blending into this really interesting combination of let's go win revenue together and do it in the most effective way possible, but let's also go do what's best for the user. And it's really, those two things were kind of things people said, but not always did together. And at least at Weaviate, I can confidently say we're really doing those things in a very seamless and exciting motion. And that comes down to the future of RevOps for me. So, just covering back what we talked about, real-time insights are driving action. Scarf is a major player there, as well as Common Room and several other tools. But we get to see these signals in terms of adoption of our product and open source, and prioritize the right accounts to go talk to them at the right time so that we're helping them with what they need to do. Scarf combined with Common Room really creates that unified customer view, and then pipeline efficiency through signal stacking. At the end of the day, efficiency is super important. We've seen this huge shift, both macro and micro, about companies becoming really efficient in their go-to-market motions. And you can't do that without focusing your reps, BDRs, sellers, entire go-to-market team on the right opportunity, and really minimizing the scope of what they're looking at to be the right things. And focusing our sellers in particular on open source usage has been a really big unlock in our pipeline growth over the last year. So that's everything I had. Like I said, happy to answer questions now, later. Not sure what the format is, Avi, but hope that was helpful.